For the third reading this morning, I've chosen some quotations from some Native American Indian wisdom carriers. The first one is from Black Elk, who was an Oglala Sioux and spiritual leader of his community. What is life? It is the flash of a firelight in the night. It is the breath of the buffalo in the winter time. It is the little shadow which runs across the grass and loses itself in the sunset. The true peace, the first peace, which is the most important, is that which comes within the souls of people when they realize their relationship, their oneness with the universe and all its powers. And when they realize that at the center of the universe dwells Wakantaka, the Great Spirit, and that this center is really everywhere. It is within each one of us. This is the real peace. And others are but reflections of this. The second peace is that which is made between two individuals. And the third is that which is made between two nations. But above all, you should understand that there can never be peace between nations until there is known that true peace, which, as I've often said, is within the souls of men. The Holy Land is everywhere. The second quotation from a leader called Crowfoot, who was a warrior and orator of the Blackfoot people. Hold on to what is good, even if it's just a handful of earth. Hold on to what you believe, even if it's a tree that stands by itself. Hold on to what you must do, even if it's a long way from here. Hold on to your life, even if it's easier to let go. Hold on to my hand, even if someday I'll be gone away from you. And the third one is a short quotation from the Dakota tribe. We will be known forever by the tracks we leave. And finally, from the Comanche, all who have died are equal. These are words inspired by God. So I spent 8 years in a seminary training to be a missionary priest, hoping to work in a third world country, particularly somewhere in Africa. And so, as well as our theological studies and biblical studies and stuff like that, for the last year in the seminary, we were trained in a method which was called community development, where they teach you how to go into a foreign culture, appreciate the language, appreciate the mythology, appreciate the lifestyle, and then try to figure out how you can be of assistance, particularly what the needs of the community might be and what resources you could bring to kind of help them out. Sometimes it was agricultural, sometimes it was educational, sometimes it was medical, sometimes it was water production. And so in 1973, I got my first kind of commissioning as, in Kenya, we called it the father in charge of a mission. Here we call it the pastor. In Ireland, we would call it the parish priest. So I was in charge of this big sprawling parish called Eldama Ravine, which it literally spanned the equator. And I've learned Swahili, and I'm sitting at a meeting of the Wazee, the elders, one day, outside in hot stones, which are really hot. And I'm giving a speech, and I'm saying to them, I realize you are the elders, you are the leaders of this community, and I've been here now for a few months. I can see what the needs are. Like water is a big issue for us here. And I've got some resources I can tap into in Europe. But you're the leaders, you need to make the decisions, and we need to try to brainstorm together, how we can solve the problems that we're experiencing in the community. And during this kind of speech that I'm giving, there's one old elder who's sitting there with this very bemused look on his face. And at one stage, he puts his hand up and says, "Can I ask you a question?" And I'm 26, I'm Irish, I know everything. So I said, "Sure, fire." And he says, "Can you tell me why it is that for you Europeans, your only response to a problem is to want to solve it?" And I'm thinking, dude, what else do you do with a problem except solve it? So I'm stuck. And I said to him, "Well, what do you do when you encounter a problem?" And I will never forget what he said to me. We were talking in Swahili, but the gist of what he said was, a problem is an invitation to self-transcendence. And if all you do with the problem is solve it, life will just give you another problem. And if your only response to the second problem is to solve it, life will give you a third and a fourth and a fifth problem until you learn to self-transcend. And then you can begin to see connections between issues, and your solutions will be far more elegant, more elegant than they would originally have been. So it was worth, I think I learned more in that one meeting than I learned in 8 years of theology in the seminary. So I've chosen as my theme for the month of January for this new year. If I were to give it a title, I would call it Grounding Your Incarnational Experience on Gaia. So what does it mean to be a human being on planet Earth in the year 2024? So that's what I'm planning to do for this Sunday and for next Sunday with God's help. So it's based on a book that I co-wrote in 2013 with Matt McKay and Ralph Metzner. And the book is called Why, What Your Life is Telling You About Who You Are and Why You're Here. And I did an interview on this with Regina Meredith, and also a lecture for the ITP community in Palo Alto, and the Wednesday Why group that was organized by Michael Choi. And I feel that it is a really important topic to begin the new year. And so I'll end each of the two homilies by looking at a kind of a simple, practical exercise to promote psychological and spiritual growth as we face this new year. Because there will be lots of problems we're going to encounter as a world community in 2024. So it becomes very, very important that before we attempt to solve these problems we encounter, it's much more important that we learn to transcend because of these problems we're going to face. And from that transcended viewpoint, to come back to planet Earth with much more lasting and much more spiritual responses. So just a few ideas then as I walk through this book today and next Sunday with God's help. So my definition of consciousness is that consciousness is self-saturated self-awareness. And so different critters have different levels of self-awareness. The self-awareness of a rock is very different from the self-awareness of an oak tree, which is different from the self-awareness of a bunny rabbit, which is different from the self-awareness of a human being, which is very different from the self-awareness of a mystic, somebody who understands God consciousness. So our function is that we are how God experiences a third dimensional reality. That's our function. We're like bees in a beehive who have been sent out by the queen to gather pollens and stories and bring them back to the hive. God experiences through us. So there's the transcendence of God, which is totally ineffable, which cannot be articulated, but we can experience it. And then there's the immanence of God. God as she expresses herself through nature. And so in that sense, nature is how God experiences. And this involves reincarnation. It involves understanding who you are. It involves understanding where you are between lifetimes. And it helps you to shift your self-identity. And this cosmos is a playground, created. And there are some very, very scary rides in this cosmos. And Earth is one of the scariest. People who volunteer for incarnation on planet Earth are very, very brave souls. Problem is, most of us have forgotten who we are and why we've come. And so I want to look then at the three levels of the self. I call them the role self, the soul self, and the source self. So the role self is the character you're playing in this incarnation. It doesn't define you. It simply defines the mission you're on this time round. And so, playing the best game you can, given the role that you've assigned yourself, that's your role self. And in Hinduism, they would call that jiva, the aspect of the soul that incarnates. And this is true for not just the individual, it's true for groups. Groups have a role self that they play a particular function in humanity. Then the second level is, I would call it the soul self. Hinduism would call it the Atma. And the soul self is like, who you truly are before you were born and after you die. It is the eternal essence that was never born and actually never dies. And it's Atma in the Hindu model. And then the third level of the self, I would call the source self, God, or the transcendent. But every single one of us is a bite-sized piece of God. So we have to understand the differentiate between a true self-identity and a false self-identity. So Hinduism puts it really beautifully. It says, I have a body, but I'm not my body. I have emotions, but I am not my emotions. I have an intellect, but I am not my intelligence. So who am I? I would say I'm a spirit in a spacesuit. I would say I am a soul on safari on planet Earth. I would say I'm a bite-sized piece of God who volunteered for incarnation in this 3D dense a kind of place called planet Earth. So I'm a holographic fractal of Source itself. So it becomes really, really important that before we attempt any kinds of self-transcendence or any kind of solutions to the problems presenting us in 2024, we have to, get this identity of self really true, that you're a fractal of the divine, a holographic fractal of the divine. And from that kind of transcendent self perspective, you have much better chance, of encountering and dealing with the problems that lie ahead. The next idea, and I talked about this in great detail, in fact, in December, that it becomes incumbent upon each one of us to create what I would call a personal cosmology, a philosophy of life, which is subject to you, which you've articulated yourself. And I suggest that a personal cosmology is built around 4 key questions. And the 4 questions are, who is God? When I say God, what do I mean? Who am I? When I say I, what do I mean by I? Who is my neighbor? When I say neighbor, what do I mean by neighbor? And then fourthly, mission. When I say mission, what does mission mean to me? Now, a personal cosmology must be able to deal with all these 4 questions. And it should do 4 things for you. Firstly, it should make your soul sing. Secondly, it should stretch you out of your cosmological comfort zone. Thirdly, it must be able to explain everything you experience. And then fourthly, it needs to be constantly updated. So it's unique to you. And everybody has to work on that constantly. And so it results in what I call a kind of mathematically a 2x2 matrix. If you take a window pane with 4 panes of glass in it, so there are 2 columns and there are 2 rows. And so if the columns are conscious and unconscious, and the rows are good and evil, you get 4 panes of glass. So if you're unconsciously good, you're simply lucky. If you're unconsciously evil, you're asleep. If you're consciously evil, you're pathological. And if you're consciously good, you're enlightened. And so it becomes really important into which quadrant do I fall? Am I unconscious completely? Am I conscious? And if I am conscious, where am I putting my energies? Am I creating good, or problems for people? The next issue we dealt with in the book was to differentiate between karma, fate, and destiny. Karma for me is not a punitive mechanism whereby I'm punished in this incarnation for mistakes I made in a previous incarnation. Rather, karma was the lesson plan I set myself before I came down this time. I sat with my heavenly mentor and we created a lesson plan and said, you chose to be born into this family, into this culture, into this kind of body at this stage of human history. So the karma is actually the lesson plan with which you're born. It involves the preconception contract that you made with a soul group. So karma really, every single one of us, when we're born, if we had the realization, we would have cheered and said, wow, I've been born into exactly the correct circumstances that I wanted in order to learn the lesson I needed and to make the contribution I wanted. So that for me is karma. Fate then is where this should lead us if we follow it. If I follow the lesson plan and I follow what I set out for myself and I cleave to my mission, fate is what awaits me. However, if I don't play it well, if I take missteps, then I encounter my destiny instead of my fate. And destiny is where I wind up when I didn't follow the lesson plan or I didn't follow the mission I was on. And then that will lead to a new karmic lesson plan the next time I come around. The next thing I want to mention is the notion of a wise mind. There's a huge difference between wisdom and knowledge. I've said this many, many, many times. Knowledge is data that are generated by the sensorium and processed by the brain, whereas wisdom is data that's generated by the soul and processed by the heart. So they're very, very, very different. So when I say a wise mind, I'm not talking about our ability to reason, I'm not talking about our intellect, and I'm not talking about emotions. That is not the wise mind. The wise mind is the deep intuitive place in me, the kind of the right brain activity that plugs me into source itself. That's the real wise mind. So the problem-solving mind then is about fixing things, whereas wise mind is about how to live. They're totally different. And this is what the old man on the equator was telling me, that I was operating from a problem-solving mind where I wanted to fix stuff in the locality. And indeed, there were problems that need to be kind of dealt with. But the wise mind is, how do you live in the middle of those problems? And how do you transcend away above the kind of the battlefield and see the connections and the links so that when you come back down, you've got a much more elegant approach to the problems you're encountering. I want to differentiate then between four notions which are seemingly quite close, but they're actually very, very different from each other. That is joy, pleasure, happiness, and perfection. So joy is being present, but it passes. It's the beauty of the moment. So joy constantly gets hijacked by the past and the future. So joy is watching a beautiful sunset, but then the sun is going to go down, and it's going to get really, really cold. And so now you're wondering, what am I going to do, when I go home? Or, did I finish that job I was supposed to do yesterday? So joy constantly gets hijacked by the past and by the future. But for a little moment, it's beautiful because I'm really in the moment temporarily. Pleasure is different from that. Pleasure is basically the release of endorphins. It's not an emotion, actually. It's a neurological experience. It's the release of endorphins. And all mammals habituate to pleasure. I have to eat more and more rum raisin ice cream before I get the same kick out of it. I love rum raisin ice cream, but I have to eat a whole tub to get the same kick from it that I did from a spoonful 2 years ago. So pleasure is literally a neurological experience, and all mammals would habituate to it. So there can't be any ultimate peace or ultimate happiness in just pleasure. I'm not saying it's bad, but it doesn't last. So what is happiness then, as distinct from joy or pleasure? Happiness is when I am aligned with my mission, when I am content with what happens. I know how to harvest it, and it's based on how I want to be, not on what I want to happen. So how do I harvest the present moment? So as to be with it and be much more concerned about being with it. So happiness it's temporary again, but it's when I'm in alignment with the mission I came to accomplish. Perfection is slightly different. Perfection is the commitment to the mission. No matter how many times I fall and fail, I'm still committed. It's the commitment of a little acorn that's going to keep trying no matter where it finds itself. It's going to try to put down roots, and it's going to try to become an oak tree. And it's going to take 50 years for an acorn to become an oak tree capable of producing its own acorns. And so perfection then is not about sinlessness. It's about telos. It's about a teleological drive that's attracting us toward a particular kind of a goal. And so no matter how many times I fall, perfection means I get back up and I try again. It's not about not committing sins. We're all going to make mistakes. And sin then is merely a feedback mechanism. In the scriptures, is taken from the metaphor for archery. You take a shot at the target and you miss. But that's hugely important because the feedback tells you I'm aiming too high or too far to the left. So I need to readjust my aim. So the times we fall are hugely important feedback that allow us to kind of improve our aim. So that for me is what perfection is. And then enlightenment is the permanent alignment with mission, where happiness was the kind of the temporary alignment with the mission. Enlightenment is the permanent alignment with the mission. But this enlightenment is not a binary situation. Either you're enlightened or you're not enlightened. It's not binary. It's like a slider. If you look at the switch on your wall, some of them just on off. You have the light on or off, which is binary. Others are a slider. You can increase the luminosity of the bulb by sliding it up and down. Enlightenment is like that. It's not either you're enlightened or you're not. It's a question of how far up can we slide it to be more and more in alignment with God. Let me say something then about the purpose itself or the mission itself. I believe that once we volunteer to come onto planet Earth, what we encounter is improv theater. There is no plot, there is no script. If there were, we wouldn't be learning. And so we come in, and the greatest lesson planet Earth offers us is how to love in the face of pain, and in the face of difficulties, and in the face of problems. That's the greatest lesson of all planet Earth offers us. How do you love anyway in the face of pain and disappointment and problems? So we're not here to be judged for our mistakes. We're here to learn from them. That's what perfection consists of. And in order to do that, we come down with different kinds of gifts. So when you take, for instance, Apollo 11 that landed on the moon in 1969, the astronauts had particular kinds of spacesuits that allowed them to survive on the atmosphere of the moon and also to do some elementary tasks. And so the spacesuit had to make sure that they were safe and that they were able to do some work. Now, this is our moonshot. Every one of us here has landed in some kind of reversed moonshot. We find ourselves on planet Earth, and we've got this particular kinds of spacesuits that can allow us to survive here and to do the tasks that we've come to do. So the mission equipment basically is that we got a physical body, we have emotions, we have an intellect, we have desires, we have values, and we have talents. And these are the artifacts of the equipment with which we come to live life on planet Earth. And I believe particularly that we come with two kinds of gifts on planet Earth. The first gift is the talents we have. And the second one is the problems we find within ourselves. So the talents do not belong to us. We're like a mailman with a bag of letters. The fact that all the letters are inside the mailman's bag does not mean that the letters belong to the mailman. They don't. They belong to the people whose names are on the envelopes. And that's what talents are. Every one of us is a male person that's come down with a bag full of talents to be used for the wider community. Now we can earn a living from it, which is fine, but we're not entitled to make a killing from it because they do not belong to us. We're simply delivering it to the planet. So the talents are the gifts we come with for other people. The problems are the gifts we come with for ourselves, because the problem is the invitation to self-transcendence. So every single one of us is going to choose, 2 or 3 virtues or problems that we're going to work on in a particular incarnation. And these are our gift to ourselves. And if you really want to understand what is my unique mission on planet Earth, look at 2 things. Look at the talents with which you've been gifted, and look at the fears that hold you up. You want to figure out what you've come to do, look at your fears and look at your talents. And that will tell you really, really quickly what your purpose and what your mission is. And it's absolutely unique. For every single person, it is unique. It's amazing how you can be unique among 8 billion people, but it's not a problem. When you take, for instance, you take the English language, the alphabet consists of merely 26 symbols. But from those 26 symbols, all the works of Shakespeare. There are about 300,000 words in the English language, and there's another 600,000 technical terms in English. So you've got almost 1 million words in English, and they're all composed of merely 26 different symbols. So even with a tiny number of symbols, you can create this extraordinary literature. Or look at music. So basically you've got 7 notes in music, but everything from Tchaikovsky to Hannah Burke is using those 7 notes to create this extraordinary symphony. Reduce it further and you look at your DNA. You only have 4 nucleotides, and still your genes are composed, your total individuality is composed of, combinations and permutations of simply 4 nucleotides. And the simplest one of all, you take our computers. They're based on Boolean algebra. George Boole was the professor of mathematics at University College Cork in the 1840s and 1850s. He invented what's called binary mathematics. And that's the origin of everything you see on your screen. Every color, every word, every sound you're hearing is basically manipulating 2 symbols, 0s and 1s. And so the fact, that there are 8 billion people on the planet doesn't mean that every single one of us hasn't a unique destiny. So to end with today, I want to propose an exercise. I call it the river of life. And here's the exercise. Quite simple. Take a piece of paper and create 4 columns on your piece of paper. And then divide your life into 7-year chunks. So your rows are going to be 7-year chunks. So from 0 to 7, from 7 to 14, 14 to 21, 21 to 28, etc. And for each of these segments, write down who are the important people at that stage of my life. Between 0 and 7, who are the important people in my life? Obviously, parents, siblings. The second thing I want you to write down in the 3rd column is, what were the important events that happened to me during that period of life? And then in the final column, what were the important lessons I learned during that stage of life? Now, sometimes those lessons can only be understood post factum. You're not at an age of 3 able to say, okay, I understand what my lesson is at age 3. You don't understand it, certainly consciously. And so these 4 columns divided into chunks of 7 years. So for instance, between 14 and 21, who were the important people in my life then? What were the important events in my life then? You know, what were the lessons that I learned as I look back retroactively? Look at, for me, 70 to 77. Who were the important people in my life in this 7-year period? What are the important events that happened to me during this period? And what have I learned in this period? So I really encourage you as we face into 2024 to this quick kind of resume of your life to date, and the most important piece of all perhaps is, what have you learned? People are important, the events are important, but what have you learned and how have you grown? And how can you use those lessons as you face into 2024 and you're part of a cosmic brain, you're a fractal of the divine sent to planet Earth in this density of time and space in order to be a healing presence for us. Namaste, my brothers and sisters.